The Governor's Cup Yacht Race, held every 2 years, is a 1,700-mile downwind sail from Simonstown, South Africa, to the remote island of St Helena in the South Atlantic. In December 2010, 16 yachts from around South Africa set off on the 7th edition of the race on an adventure that would test the sailors to their limits in one of the toughest Governor's Cup races yet. Last week on the Governor's Cup, 16 yachts from across South Africa started the Governor's Cup Yacht Race on the 1st of December 2010. 11 monohull and 5 multi-hull yachts had started the race in perfect weather at the start line off Simonstown. Yes! But the conditions quickly took a turn for the worse as the fleet began rounding the fearsome Cape of Storms. An uncharacteristic summer storm developed and tore through the fleet, and by the end of the first night at sea, 6 boats had been forced to suspend racing. IRC racers and favourites to win the Cup, Leisegang and Reaction, had been pummeled during the night. By daybreak, Leisegang had broken her boom, and Reaction's rudder had been torn clean off. The ferocious sea conditions had rendered the crew of the cruising-class monohull Leisegang useless, as seasickness paralysed the entire crew, while the Mura Opskit had been swamped in the night and the crew were left with no option but to retire.
I'd say the wind was over 55 knots and the sea was the size of a 3-story building that we were going up over.
And then with the first sunlight, we realised no engine, no rudder. We've got to try and sail this boat either to Saldanha Bay or to Cape Town.
Still, it's a huge effort, and to see that go in a fraction of a second, you keep asking yourself for weeks thereafter, what could I have done to avoid it?
All 4 boats had made for Langebaan on the west coast of South Africa to lick their wounds and take stock of their situation. Only 2 would resume racing. Meanwhile, at the head of the fleet, 3 of the fastest yachts were locked in a battle for the lead of the race. The fastest yacht in the fleet is a cutting-edge trimaran called Banjo, with 2008 race winner Jeremy Bagshaw co-skippering with Banjo's owner, Frans Lewis. They entered the race with one thing in mind: to take line honours, the first boat to physically finish before handicap is factored in. Banjo had had an excellent first night and was neck and neck with rival Billy Leisegang on board Our Diane. Billy has entered the race 3 times before and walked away with 2 wins and a line honours title. Billy and Our Diane have returned this year in an attempt to take the trophy for an unprecedented 3rd time. Joining the lead boats at the front of the fleet is a 42-foot yacht called Swimlion, sailed by a crew of 5, who are all skippers in their own right. All 3 had blasted away from the fleet and used the conditions to their advantage, managing to put excellent distance between themselves and the rest of the fleet. By the 3rd day at sea, Our Diane, Banjo and Swimlion were still neck and neck. All 3 were within 20 miles of each other. The rest of the fleet were over 150 miles behind by this stage. But within the different classes, other races were being tightly contested. Zigzag and Lone Star, 2 catamarans, were battling for 2nd place in the multi-hull division, which was being led by Banjo near the front of the fleet. While the monohull cruising division, led by Swimlion in the front, was being stormed upon by Rotary Scout, who'd been on a charge after a 6-hour delay at the start. Through a combination of misfortune for others and their own skill, they had moved from 9th in class to 3rd, just behind Dawn, skippered by Saldanha Bay Yacht Club Commodore Trevor Dyer. 2 other monohulls, Tedwick and Haiku, were still in Simonstown with teething problems, but were still determined to rejoin the race. As the first weekend of the race approached, the lead boats began to feel the effects of the trade winds filling in. The wind was becoming more constant, and the Atlantic swells that travel in a northwesterly direction with the wind towards St Helena had started rolling. These gigantic but gentle swells of 3 to 5 meters are spread far apart and are exactly what the boats out here are looking for. Hooking enough surfs on these is the difference between winning and losing.
Look for the right waves there. Waves are here.
But by midday Saturday, the weather at the front of the fleet had eased off, and the leaders were in light winds and lumpy seas, only managing about 170 miles in the next 24 hours.
You've just clocked 1,000 miles to go.
Is that right?
Yeah.
All right.
Is that your happy face?
During this time, Banjo slipped past Swimline into second place, just behind our Diane. But the most surprising news was the rejoining of the race by Tinus Groenewald and his crew aboard Reaction, who'd sailed to Langebaan without a rudder for repairs.
Ons is weer aan die gang, man. Het is Saterdagoggend, 7:50. Die vierde, kan nie wees nie, nog het hy is die eerste. Tiller is en ek wil net voel hulle is daar, nuwe tiller. Yes, hier is ons besig om Mykonos Saldanha Bay te verlaat. En dit is net incredible, spesifiek vir Janie en sy team baie baie dankie. As jy dit ooit sien, dit is incredible wat julle gedoen het.
Tidwik, the solo entry, also left Simonstown after 3 days of repairs to her self-steering. Her skipper, Roger McCormick, was going to have to beg the wind gods if he was going to make the cut-off date of December the 18th. The Mura Haiku, who'd been battling with sail furling issues, was also well on its way at last. But the sail issues weren't their last, and a rogue wave near Cape Point had torn James Scott's spray dodger off just a few hours into their sail.
Over here, it's completely ripped off. It's completely ripped off. So got to still sail this bit back on. So hopefully by the day after tomorrow, my sailing attempts will be finished.
Reaction came storming out of Langebaan and was right back up to racing speed in a strong southeaster and notched up an impressive first 24-hour run of 220 miles. Lying 600 miles off the coast of Africa is a huge underwater mountain range called the Walvis Ridge. Within this ridge is a section that rises from almost 5,000 meters to just 23 meters within a few miles.
Riviera Banks is the highest part of a ridge in the South Atlantic Ocean where the seabed rises up to as little as 23 meters from the surface. And that rises up from a depth of almost 5,000 meters. So it's a very steep feature, and so much so that in the shallow patches in mid-ocean, for no apparent reason, of course the reason is obvious, you get waves breaking in heavy weather. A place to be avoided.
The shortest route from Cape Town to St Helena is straight over the banks. But the banks are notorious for rough seas, and our Diane has encountered these seas on the banks before. Despite the relatively benign weather, they still decided to give them a wide berth.
The smoother, sort of more efficient route we adopted was in fact south of the bank. About 2 hours ago we took the decision to go south of the bank on the heading which we were doing.
We can't quite do that 345. Ready to
320. Because the problem of actually making it around this, and possibly finding ourselves there after nightfall.
We'll have a look at it now.
Okay.
This heading, combined with an awkward wind direction, pushed them far off their preferred course to Ireland and would cost them valuable miles. But while our Diane was negotiating the Valdivia banks, elsewhere others were caught up with their own problems.
We just had a phone call from Isa the yacht with the children on, the 2 young children, and they're quite a way back, closer to South Africa still. And Billy and Spook just spoke to them, and they were saying that they're in really bad weather and they're really concerned. and I think they're calling around to various people to see what people think about the weather. So we're just having a quick look again on our weather update to see whether we can see something, and then give them a shout back just to try and just reassure them. Apparently they sounded quite nervous, and it's just the husband and wife with 2 very small children on board. So we're just going to have a look now at our weather site and see what we can see for them. Oh my word. They're in this band over here, which is very strong. We're up here more out of that. But there's this very strong band here.
You're going to have different weather coming through. Looking at the forecast that we had earlier today, at the moment you've got very heavy weather, probably where you are further inshore. But it doesn't stretch all that much offshore. As soon as you get out of it, then the wind goes down to 15 to 20 knots. But there's definitely a strong patch against the shore.
Around Diane, the ocean was rolling along like usual. Yet just 350 miles away, Leon and his girls were fighting to keep Isa from pitch-poling in the steep seas. Fortunately, dawn brought the news that the weather had abated, and Isa reported that they were safe at the 7 a.m. report to Cape Town radio. The same weather that Isa the catamaran was battling was like a godsend for the crew of Reaction, whose super-fast downwind boat was reveling in the tough conditions. Meanwhile, at the front of the fleet, the weather couldn't have been more different, and our Diane had an exhausting night unwrapping the spinnaker in the light winds. After a long and slow night on board our Diane, the exhausted crew knew the morning report could have some nasty news in store. The light conditions had continued, and as they had feared, the night had taken its toll. Banjo had taken back 24 miles on our Diane, and the difference to island between them was just 1 mile, although Banjo's course was further south. On board Banjo, France and Jeremy had a crucial decision to make. When do they jibe north to bring them onto a course for the island? Knowing the correct time to execute was everything. And Banjo cleverly waited till the positions of the morning reports had been made before they jibed, knowing they had a full 24 hours till the next report to keep this decision hidden. By Monday morning, Swimlion had fallen back over 40 miles behind the 2 lead boats, yet was still leading the monohull division by almost 250 miles over Rotary Scout in second place, having overtaken Dawn from Saldanha Bay. The guard boat Marty Lesser was lying fourth, just ahead of Blazon, who'd done well after their delay in Langebaan. Haiku was trailing the front of the fleet by over 500 miles, while the little solo entry, Tadwick, was 700 miles behind. The IRC boat Reaction with her new rudder had been making excellent pace, but was still 500 miles back. In the multi-hull class, which Banjo was leading, Lone Star, Zigzag and HQ Simagaroor were locked in a battle for the last podium positions almost 200 miles back, with Isa bringing up the rear of the multi-hull fleet. Banjo's decision to jibe north after the morning report was a brilliant tactical decision, and our Diane shouldn't have known about it until the position report the next morning, 24 hours later.
No, yacht. See it, red spinnaker.
Straight behind us. Yeah. I'm pointing at them now.
Crossing our skirt, though.
Wake you down.
Looks like they're crossing our skirt.
Now, how did they get this? It's quite a big moment. So we thought, yeah, Banjo's on the horizon. They've just gone across our stern.
Oh, lovely. That's beautiful. No, I'm always happy to have competition. That's the important thing. You've got to win.
True.
But, no, that's beautiful.
The good news is we are well ahead of them, having gained today.
Do you think that's well ahead?
Beautiful. Ah.
They were 2 miles astern, according to the website. They're in a distance to St Helena. They were 1 mile further back than we were, according to the website.
Okay.
This is more than 1 mile or 2 miles. This is now
It's about 5 miles, but I'm going to get the binocs out because I want to see what they got up.
Yeah.
I think they got
Can you grab the binos?
I reckon these guys are 5 to 6 miles this trip. I'm simply nervous. They are in sight. The uncertainty has been resolved. We have them, and they're behind. They've been behind all the time. They're further behind than they were this morning at 7 o'clock. But
That is true.
that's true.
That is true.
Now how do we stop them?
Maybe just keep going.
Get out the missile.
Follow our strategy and stick to it.
And that is?
Shortest route to the islands.
Snail Lane.
Yeah, they're not where you said they were, right?
No.
How did they get there?
This is not a good moment for me. Yacht Banjo, Banjo, Banjo. This is the yacht Ardahan, over. Banjo, Banjo, Banjo. This is the yacht Ardahan, over. No response from Banjo. This is Ardahan, standing by 16.
Our Diane certainly knew where Banjo was at last, but the question was, had Banjo spotted Our Diane? And would it make a difference to their decision to jibe north that morning?
I think we were pretty much sailing our own race. We didn't really need the threat of someone close to us to sail faster. We were going as fast as we could. Our Diane had a very white sail combination, white spinnaker, white mainsail. In the haze on the horizon, very difficult to pick up, so we didn't see them now.
Our Diane kept a keen eye right into the evening to see if Banjo would change direction. But Banjo stuck to her game plan and disappeared over the northeastern horizon in the early evening. The crew of Our Diane waited in anticipation for the position reports to come in. Our Diane had made 174 miles good to the island in the last 24 hours, but Banjo had only clocked 158. Our Diane's lead had stretched back up to 18 miles, Banjo having made the sacrifice on distance to use the speed gained to get further north than Our Diane, hopefully setting themselves up with a better angle on the island. This should allow them to sail a faster course with the current wind angle. Swim Lion was still losing ground to both boats, and the race for line honours was fast becoming a two-horse race. The line honours title is given to the first boat that physically crosses the finish line first, and for many boat builders, this is the dream. To be the fastest design, irrespective of handicap. But yacht racing is a complex sport, and fast boats have big handicaps that bring them down to size, allowing slower boats the potential to beat them. If Banjo finished the race in 10 days exactly, Our Diane could still finish 1 day, 2 hours and 40 minutes behind, and still win on handicap. A little boat like Tidwick could finish 5 days later and still win. The boats had now been at sea for a week, and the leaders were within 600 miles of the island. At the tail end of the fleet, the last boat, Tidwick, still had double that distance to go. The next 2 days saw a dramatic change in the leaderboard for both line honours and the monohull cruising division lead. Swim Lion, who had been battling with Banjo and Our Diane at the head of the fleet, announced that they were withdrawing from the race and were going to use their engine due to travel commitments on St Helena. The light wind had affected their ETA at St Helena, and owner Derek Frey had to catch the RMS St Helena bound for Ascension Island for a flight home to the UK for Christmas. Overnight, Rotary Scout had been handed the lead of the monohull cruising division, something which was totally unexpected after their 6-hour delay at the start. The huge multi-hull catamaran HQ Simigaraw also retired from 4th place in multi-hull and was headed for Walvis Bay in Namibia, also due to timetable commitments. Our Diane was still physically ahead of Banjo by a few hours, and their handicap lead was even more. With just a few days to the island remaining, it was looking like only a disaster could prevent our Diane from taking both line honours and the Governor's Cup. And at 6:30 a.m. on day 8, just as our Diane was crossing the 0-degree meridian from the eastern to western hemisphere, that's exactly what happened.
Police saw the emulsions have started, so it's quickly going to start the engine, battery slow, so swapping them over, see if we can get some more charge. We've just crossed over into the western hemisphere over the Greenwich line, and what was meant to be a celebration and enjoying is had a little bit of a downer when we found out this morning we've got no power left. So we can't get weather reports anymore, we can't communicate. We've got a handheld satellite phone which we're going to use now and call through to the race officer through the Cape Town radio to do that kind of thing. But otherwise we're a dark ship now and we've got about 450 miles to go. So it's going to be interesting from here on. Can't charge the camera either. Still celebrating crossing the line. East to west. Oh, someone's going to be sick.
I went like to take a rest for a little while. Blow my head off.
Because you're crossing the meridian. Let's see you.
At 7:15 a.m. on day 8, our Diane disappeared off the Altec Netstar tracker. On board was only a handheld GPS with spare batteries and a lightly charged sat-for-rent handheld satellite phone that could only be turned on for morning reports. They were unable to receive weather forecasts and would struggle to maintain a picture of the fleet. And from a safety point of view, they would have no lights, both on board and navigational, making our Diane an invisible and vulnerable place to be.
The first watch has gone up on top. I'm lying in my bunk. The wind has picked up this evening and we're scooting along at about 10 knots. When you lie in your bunk and you start listening to the sounds, right up above here on the roof is the crew on watch now. You've got all the winches and the sheets creaking around you. Beneath me is 5,000 meters of ocean, and right outside this panel here, if you listen, you can hear the Atlantic Ocean going past.
Life on board an ocean racing yacht is difficult to adjust to. Your world just never stops moving. Your bed is always at an angle. The noise is immense, and the water in the toilet bowl is always splashing over. Cooking is an art form during which a mistake could prove fatal. Fresh water is scarce, and a freshwater shower is even scarcer. And the odors are enough to make blue cheese blush.
Totally love myself. My partner, I believe, says he loves me as I am. So with it make it true, I think I'll carry on for another day.
Zimbabwean dollars.
I can't say the same thing again. Sure.
I think I look just gorgeous.
Oh my word. Oh my word.
Showers. I hope you can finish.
Cleanliness is relative when ocean racing, and even when you've washed yourself with salt water, the clothes you put back on still smell like you did before you washed. The 10th morning at sea, and our Diane had been trimming the spinnaker throughout the night in the hope of closing the gap to Banjo. But during the morning report, the news came through that was not good. Banjo had opened up their lead in the line honours race by a further 10 miles to 35 miles.
It was well practiced and he cashed in on that. And now that we're getting into the swing of it, we seem to be dropping in, but yeah, he bounced when we were weak.
And with just 170 miles left to the island, our Diane was running out of distance and time.
Well, with a little bit of luck and a bit of wind tonight, that might be the last sunset that we see out at sea. We're 110 miles short of St Helena now, and we're hoping that we might be there before lunch tomorrow. So keep our eyes on the horizon tonight.
Banjo had found their groove in the last few days and reported doing an incredible 105 miles in 12 hours through the night, flying along at 15 knots at times. But one of the most incredible stories going almost unnoticed was the chase Reaction was putting in. Reaction had lost her rudder on the first night and only restarted the race in Langebaan 4 days later. Paying close attention to the forecast, they managed to hook into a completely different weather system that took them on a considerably different course to the rest of the fleet, clocking up over 1,000 miles in 5 days. The fast IRC boat had caught up with the cruising class fleet, and had it not been for the rudder failure, the leaderboard may have looked vastly different. With the sun setting on both our Diane's and Banjo's last night at sea, they were both acutely aware that there was only 30 miles separating them. Our Diane went into the last night in a building wind that saw them speeding to the island in the hope of cutting the corner on Banjo.
It's 4 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, December the 11th now. We've been sailing for almost 10 days exactly, and we're 40 miles out from St Helena. It's a pitch black night. There's no stars, nothing at all. Our boat is still completely dark, and of course as we're getting closer to the island, we're trying to keep an eye out, not just for the island, which we can't see at all in the dark at the moment, but also the other 2 yachts that were so close to us a couple of days ago that'll be converging on the island around about the same time as us now. But still not a single light anywhere, still pitch black all around us.
The island of St Helena was still sleeping when Frans Lewitz and Jeremy Bagshaw on board Banjo appeared through the gloom of night. And despite our Diane's best efforts, had managed to hold on to their 30-mile lead, taking line honours in the 2010 Governor's Cup, with an elapsed time of 9 days, 18 hours and 59 minutes.
Yes, we certainly are happy to be the first boat in at St Helena. The race went well for us. We had the first 4 days was fairly windy coming out of Cape Town. Myself took a few days to get my sea legs. I suffer from Maldemere, and that forced me to keep my foot off the pedal a bit. But after about 4 days, my co-skipper Jeremy Bagshaw convinced me that it was time to put the foot down, and then we speeded up a bit. The middle section of the race was some light wind, and then the last 2 or 3 days, beautiful southeast trades, and yesterday and the day before, some of the best sailing I've had in many, many years.
So it's been 9 days, 20 hours, 2 minutes and 15 since we last saw land, and now just over there, that little dark grey patch in the distance is St Helena Island.
6 hours later, our Diane was spotted off the island, making way for the finish line just offshore. Our Diane had finished the race just 6 hours behind the faster trimaran Banjo. Although they missed out on the line honours title, they crossed the finish line off St Helena on Saturday morning at 11:37 a.m. in a time of 10 days, 1 hour and 37 minutes. When we calculated with handicap factored in, our Diane pipped Banjo by 21 hours. Even a short glance at the rest of the fleet showed the nearest boat to be more than 3 days out. And even the next fastest boat, JML Rotary Scout, could not afford to finish more than a day behind our Diane if they wanted a chance to win the overall handicap race. For our Diane, the Governor's Cup looked a certain thing. There are few places on Earth that are as remote or difficult to reach as St Helena. Firstly, there's nowhere to land a plane. And the closest piece of land with an airport is Ascension Island, 700 sea miles away. To get to St Helena, you need sea legs. Sea legs and a brave spirit, as the only physical connection the island has with the outside world is a small ship called the RMS St Helena. RMS stands for Royal Mail Ship and was the name given to vessels whose role it was to service vital mail and cargo routes before air travel. The RMS visits the island once every few weeks and is both a cargo and passenger vessel. The greatest attraction of the Governor's Cup race is the RMS. Ocean racing is a selfish sport, and the sailors often leave their families behind for weeks. For the Governor's Cup race, the families can travel from Cape Town to the island on board the RMS and meet up with their smelly sailors on the island. Once the race is over, the teams load their yachts onto the cargo deck of the RMS and travel back to Cape Town in luxury together. The Governor's Cup is 3 holidays in one. There is the sail to the island, the island itself, and the RMS trip back to Cape Town. But it is the remote island that is the real drawcard for the Governor's Cup entrance. Even Antarctica and Everest can be reached by aircraft in a few hours, but St Helena is days from the nearest port of departure. And this alone makes her one of the most exciting, interesting and evocative destinations on Earth. The island was only discovered in 1502 by passing Portuguese seafarers who kept her discovery a secret. In 1659, the British discovered her and quickly realized the strategic value of her location in trade winds of the South Atlantic. Like the Dutch did in the Cape, the British East India Company set up station, and the island soon became an invaluable link in the Far East trade route, resupplying ships as they passed by en route to the east or back. The British posted a governor to this Tavern of the Seas in 1660, and there has been a governor in place ever since.
A governor really here is unique. There are other overseas territories, but I don't believe the governor's role anywhere else is quite like here. When you come here, you have an island that isn't self-sufficient, and therefore the governor has a very real role in looking after the financial arrangements, in looking after the shipping, in looking after the interrelationships with anywhere else. I mean, I span HMG, the British government that provides the funding, and the council here who actually manages the spending of it. So it's very much almost a private sector role, really, in that it's about efficiency of operation of government and about optimizing the spending for the grant aid that we get from the UK.
St Helena's remoteness and harsh volcanic geology made her easy to defend, and the British simply filled in the gaps of the island to make for an almost impenetrable fort, the remnants of which can still be seen today. It was these elements that inspired Britain to send public enemy number 1, Napoleon Bonaparte, in 1815. Napoleon never left the island and died there at his Longwood residence 6 years later, in 1821. His home is one of the island's major tourist attractions, and the island is already gearing up for the bicentennial of his arrival in 2015. Today, the island has lost its maritime value and is hardly given a second glance by most of the world. But it is exactly this, combined with its remoteness and completely unspoiled landscape, that makes the island such a rich and rewarding place to visit. The island is just 10 miles long and 6 miles wide, with a surface area of just 47 square miles. The outer reaches of the island are mainly volcanic rock, twisted into bizarre and intimidating shapes. But as the land rises towards the interior, the geology creates its own microclimate, and the vegetation changes dramatically. Stark, barren rock gives way to green English country lanes, which open up into subtropical jungles the higher you climb. Diane's Peak at 823 meters towers above the interior, and the entire island can be seen from a walk up her lush green slopes. St Helena deserves the title Land of Contrast more than any other. And this glaring contrast can be seen all over the island. One moment you're traveling down a narrow country lane wide enough for a single car, and the next you're descending a steep and precarious mountain pass through a rocky desert landscape into the capital, Jamestown. Jamestown is the only town on the island and is squeezed in between two enormous cliffs. The seaport was heavily fortified in the past, and today the forts are still used as part of the town's building. Jamestown is a classic example of British Georgian architecture, and almost all the buildings date back to her days of discovery. One of Jamestown's most iconic features is a huge staircase with 699 steps called Jacob's Ladder. The ladder was built in 1829 as an inclined plane, and today is used by the islanders as a shortcut from the suburbs on top of the mountain to the town below. But a shortcut she is anything but.
I've heard Jamestown described as the quintessential Atlantic seaport. And I think in many respects that's very true. And I guess perhaps if people think about an Atlantic seaport, they think about the bigger ports. But actually, Jamestown, in many respects, captures every aspect of what the Atlantic represents in terms of sea trading and the impact of a big ocean on those places. It interfaces wholly with the ocean.
Outside of Jamestown, St Helena is bursting with attractions for visitors.
We're sat here at Longwood House, which is the one place that probably every visitor who comes to St Helena will visit, and is the one place that probably most people, if they come from off island, know about. It's where Napoleon was exiled, where he lived on the island, and where he died. It's just one of the main tourism attractions that we have on St Helena, and I think when people get here, they are surprised by just how much there is to do on the island. One of the postbox walks, which is, one of the variety of walks that you can do on the island, or a prisoner of war camp remains out on Deadwood Plain. That's Diana's Peak, which is the highest point on the island. Again, another brilliant walk is Prosperous Bay Plain, which is one of the desert areas. The Hartship Waterfall, so the whole natural features on the island. You can walk to them, you can drive to them, absolutely extraordinary places. There are whole fortifications and the history part of the island. In many respects, St Helena is it's a microcosm, it's the whole history of the British Empire in many respects in one small island, because absolutely everything, about probably 300, 400, 500 years worth of British history and world history, in one way or another touches this island.
The natural isolation of the island was exploited in days gone by, and the island conservationists have projects in place to protect the indigenous species. The wirebird, for example, is only found on St Helena, and ornithologists travel to the island just to catch a glimpse of this rare bird. The island's rich history is also etched into the local people, known as saints, with a population of just 3,500. These gentle and hospitable people have been cast from a global gene pool, mapping the island's diverse history since the days of sail. Before then, the island was an uninhabited rock in the Atlantic. But thanks to visiting seafarers from Europe, who brought with them African and Asian slaves and Chinese workers and even prisoners of war, the saints are surely some of the most complete people on the planet.
People will go away again, and they go away now saying we've had a great time, but even more so in the future, going away and saying this is a fabulous place, we want to come back, they want to tell their friends to visit it. It will still be a remote place to get to, but it's one that will be really worth making the effort to get here.
But while the crews of Banjo and Our Diane had been enjoying the island's hospitality for a few days, there were still 10 yachts out in the Atlantic waiting to enjoy the island. Almost 72 hours after Banjo had taken line honours, the scout boat of Marc Jennings and Peter Bosch crossed the finish line in the dark to take first place in the monohull cruising division, with an elapsed time of 12 days and 15 hours. An incredible effort by the scouts on board had seen them catch up and overtake the rest of the cruising fleet after a 6-hour delay at the start.
Totally beyond expectations. Cloud 9, everything like that. After the bad start, good finish. It's a dream come true.
Yeah, you know, when we had to turn back, it was so, at the start, it was so disappointing for everybody. And try and gee everybody up. I remember saying to everybody when we left, guys, I promise you, we will not come last.
Crossing the line just 3 hours behind them was Zigzag, who took second place in the multi-hull class, behind Banjo. 8 hours later, Lone Star crossed the finish line to secure the final podium place. In the monohull IRC racing division, which Our Diane had already won, Reaction, who'd been making excellent distance in the last few days, crossed the line after 13 days and 8 hours at sea. Her time was so good that she may have taken the overall title if she hadn't lost 3 days repairing her rudder.
3 o'clock that night, in a heavy sea, the rudder just went completely. Next thing it went straight into the wind, and that was it. And we had 2 days of running like you can't believe. We were doing 16 to 18 knots all the time. And gradually started clawing our way on the westerly side. But 3 days was just too much, where we couldn't catch up. But I think we made it in 10 and a bit days from Saldanha to St Helena, which is very fantastic for that small little boat. We'll be back. We've got some unfinished business. I really would like to try and see if we can take this cup.
Second place in the monohull cruising division was still up for grabs, and was a battle of the Commodores. Trevor Dyer, Commodore of Saldanha Bay on Dawn, and Lionel Dyke, former Commodore of False Bay on Martia Lesser, had been swapping places in the last few days. Dawn eventually sailed in just 3 hours ahead of Martia Lesser, in a time of 14 days and 7 hours. But what made Dawn's achievement even more impressive was that they had lost their forestay on day 4, and sailed the rest of the race with a severely compromised mast.
Saturday morning, on the day number 4, we were just preparing to hoist a spinnaker when we were putting the furler away, the rudder furling away, and suddenly with a bit of a bang and the forestay broke. And a bit of a scary moment, because the mast all came loose. I suddenly remembered, hold on, what can we do about this? And I had a spare forward lower shroud on board, which was way too short for the forestay. And so I decided, okay, we've got anchor chain. We can join the sort of lower shroud with anchor chain.
Everybody's got here safely, which I'm delighted with. I think it's been a good race. I am delighted that we've managed to take it out of False Bay Yacht Club around Cape Point and bring it here. I think that makes it now a unique race, and I would like to believe it will go on again the next year this time.
Isa, the family catamaran, also arrived around this time and took fourth in class in the multi-hull division. Over the next few days, the remaining boats arrived at St Helena. Blazin, who'd lost time due to seasickness, made it in 15 days. While Haiku, who had sail furling issues at the start, finished in 17 days. Unfortunately for solo sailor Roger McCormick, his little boat, Tidwick, didn't make the cut-off time of 18 days and was disqualified. Steering issues had delayed him at the start for 3 days. 3 days which would have made all the difference.
Successful completion of the biannual Governor's Cup Yacht Race. For the first time in the mini history of this race, it started from Simonstown, presenting the additional challenge of having participants round the Cape Point before setting course for St Helena.
It's a time to say thank you, and I'd like to ask, before I go too far, Your Excellency, if you bear with me, and Mrs. Kerr, Nicole, thanks for those words. But I would like to ask all the visiting yachtsmen to give a loud cheer of thanks to the island and the people on the island who made it possible for us to have such a good time.
The line honours race had been firmly secured by Banjo, as well as the win in the multi-hull division.
We should have sailed a bit faster and a bit harder than we did in the first couple of days, but that's part of the learning curve.
But first in is first in.
But the crowning glory for the 2010 edition of the race went to Billy Leisegang and the crew of Our Diane. Billy had taken first in the IRC class, first overall on handicap, and had also achieved what he set out to do. The dream of winning the Governor's Cup for a third time was finally a reality.
Yes, well, we did it. We did it. A great team. We're very fortunate to have a tremendous team together this time. We're very, very proud to get this third one in the bag.